What's up, guys, and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica, and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I am chatting to classics rock star NATALIE HAYNES. NATALIE is an author, broadcaster, podcaster, and comedian in the classic space. And today we are here to promote the newly released Divine Might, which is retelling a number of the histories in a non-fiction way of the ancient Greek goddesses. Now, in case you guys know NATALIE HAYNES' name, but Divine Might didn't ring a bell, you may know her from her other publications, including Pandora's Jar and The Ancient Guide to Modern Life, which are both of her non-fiction books. However, her fiction titles include Children of Jocasta, The Amber Fury, 1,000 Ships, and Stoneblind. So we do have a lot of ground to cover regarding books, but of course, I actually should also mention that NATALIE has an incredible show via the radio here on BBC, but is also available on podcasting platforms called NATALIE HAYNES Stands Up for the Classics. But before we can get into any of the nitty-gritty, I always like to start with a little bit of context, if that's okay with you. So, can you take us back to the bookshop that your grandmother worked in when you were a child and tell us about this environment and what kind of fostered this love for reading and this love that ultimately led you to being an author today?
Yeah, no, I always tell people I was raised by bookish wolves because my mom is now a long since retired English teacher. She went into adult ed when my brother was born. And my dad was a history teacher. And so we always had a house full of books, but not necessarily of children's books. But luckily, my grandmother worked in a bookshop, an indie bookshop, which is now, is it now an Apple store? I think it's changed hands again. Every time I go back, it was Hudson's, and then it became Dillon's, and then it became Waterstones, and then it became an Apple store, and now it's something else, I think. But which is a sort of slightly tragic arc. But yeah, so there were always books around. She worked, and book reps are absolute saints. So they are the people who turn up at bookshops and bring, proof copies and say, oh, this is coming in. Do you think you might want to order it? And they knew she had grandchildren, so they always brought in books. So I had new books all the time, not, a shiny brand new copy, but those soft covered proof copies or the remaindered ones, where they've torn the cover off. Those just get put in the bin, or as my grandmother would say it, her handbag. so yeah, I was always reading. I think I once asked the writer and humorist Fran Lebowitz when she knew she wanted to be a writer, and she said as soon as she realized that books weren't like trees and people made them. I think it didn't occur to me for a really long time that the people who made books might be people like me. But yeah, my first job, the week I turned 16, I started working in a bookstore myself. And I worked there every weekend and school holidays and then university holidays. So I still really, really miss that discount. I guess that free books all the time now. And I'm still like, wait, how much is a book?
So then I know that then you start studying classics at school, right? So this is kind of where that whole thing begins. But your real, at least from what I've understood from Google, you can correct me if this information is wrong, but that real first encounter with Greek mythology was in the Ray Harryhausen films.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. I have an older brother, so we were always watching, things that I was probably not quite old enough for and was therefore thrilled by. And he'll really mind me saying that because we're not very, there's not very much difference in our age, but luckily he'll never say this, it won't matter. And so, yeah, no, we were always watching like Clash of the Titans, or which came out in 1981, I think. So I think Chris went to see it at the cinema, but I was too small. At least that's what my mom says. But, things like Clash of the Titans and Jason and the Argonauts were always on TV. And in those days, because I'm old as the hills, of course, you couldn't just watch what you wanted to when you wanted to. You just had to wait for somebody to put it on screen. So you're just like combing the pages of the Radio Times, like, will there be anything on this bank holiday that we're like, Ray Harryhausen? So yeah, I was for sure. I saw him as a tremendous treat. And And then I started doing Latin when I was 12, I think. I started studying classics at 11 and Latin at 12, and then Greek at 14. And then I took triple classics A levels, which rightly no one would let you do now. And then my degree is in, well, inevitably in classics. I qualified for literally nothing else. So it's really lucky I kind of built this job, because otherwise there was nothing else I could have done.
So then what was that like then, coming from this background of just loving the films, which are not the most accurate, but then
No,
going into the classroom and being like, oh, wait, hold on, what's going on?
Well, it's exciting. I mean, I think lots of people want there to be a right version of a myth, and I've given it a lot of thought, perhaps more than most people. And I suspect it's because we encounter them in our childhood. So it's really important to us as children to think that, you know, there's a sort of authoritative voice. That's what we're used to hearing. You know, you only have to witness a child saying, "But why?" and a parent saying, "Because I said so," to see that that is the, you know, the final word of law in many children's minds as they grow up. And so I think probably that is why we kind of encounter myths and we're like, yeah, but what's the real version? But what's the right version? What's the original version? It's like, we don't know. We've lost between 97 and 99% of ancient literature. We've no idea. You know, we can tell you what's the earliest version that survives to us, but is that somehow more authoritative than an alternative? You know, classicists will squabble about who is the earlier out of Hesiod and Homer. They're, you know, roughly contemporaneous. There are arguments running both ways. Traditionally, we've tended to say Homer came first, you know, but now there's quite a strong movement suggesting it might have been Hesiod. But the two of them give Aphrodite completely different parentage, for example. So which is right? You know, they're both equally antique. Does it matter? I honestly don't think it does. I understand why people quest that certainty, but I think at least some of the joy of classics is acknowledging that there is this multiplicity of forms, and because that happens because stories bubble up across the entire Greek-speaking world, and of course far, far beyond it, but the bit that I know about, the Greek bit, across generations. So it's, you know, these stories are being created across you know, hundreds, thousands of miles and hundreds of years. And then by the time, you know, ancient Greece is sort of 2,000 years long from beginning to end, as far as we are from Julius Caesar. So when you think that that's what you're looking at, it's only reasonable that all these stories are completely different all the time. So yeah, you know, it was a sort of happy moment for me, therefore, when I first read, I don't know, Apollonius of Rhodes, and found out that they weren't skeletal warriors that Jason fights, but were, you know, and so on and so on. But it's always been, I've always loved the bit where you go, oh, in this version it's this. I have a quester's curiosity for collecting myth, I think.
Well, clearly you absolutely do with your plethora of work. But what's really fascinating is that you don't immediately, even though, like you said, you have your degree in classics, which you focused on Greek tragedy for your degree.
I did, yeah.
But then you go off to become
a comedian.
I ran
away and joined the circus, yeah.
So what happened there?
There was a handsome man. I don't know what to tell you. I wish I were a better person than this, but I'm just not. So there was a handsome man in my first year at college. God, he was beautiful in that way that you only can be when you're, you know, 19 or something, male or female. That there's that sort of particular kind of this, just, it's so perfect. And he was so lovely. And I made a friend of mine, this is a shaming anecdote, but I'll go right ahead with it. I made a friend of mine throw a party to which she would invite both him and me, which obviously she did. And about, I don't know, halfway through the evening, he said, I think you're the funniest girl I've ever met. And I was like, you know, that's not nothing. It's not exactly what I was hoping for, but it's not nothing. But because it was the 90s, and I'm afraid it was the sort of time when I did that sort of thing, I obviously went home with him that night. And then a few days later, he turned up at my room and he'd written a sketch for Footlights, because I was at Cambridge and they have this comedy society there, which, you know, I was sort of thrilled by it existing, because it was like, that's where Monty Python had come from. And
it's
Emma
everything.
Like, right. So, but it hadn't occurred to me. I was so shy, and then I almost never spoke to people I didn't know until I was about 25, I think. But anyway, and the sketch he brought, and this again doesn't serve me well, was just awful. And he was so pretty, I couldn't really say so. So I said, oh, I'm working on another thing, like a stand-up thing, because I loved stand-up. You know, I'd been watching Ben Elton and, you know, Newman and Baddiel and stuff. I absolutely adored stand-up. So I thought, well, I'll just have to do that. And then, so I wrote this thing, and then there was an audition for a Footlights cabaret night. They called them smokers in those days. I guess they still may. Although I'm sure no one smokes, but then maybe that's not, I'm not much of an archivist of these matters, as you can see. And he walked me to the audition. So I couldn't just run away, because he was waiting outside. then I was auditioned by Robert Webb out of Mitchell and Webb, and James Barkman, who also I think worked on Mitchell and Webb and many other things as well. And they gave me a slot in the thing, so I had to turn up and do it the next night, and it was the most giddying high, you know, just incredible. I think it's 220 people that the ADC Theatre seated in those days. They've refurbed it since. But it was like the biggest thrill. And obviously, you know, we dated for like 6 weeks or something. He broke my heart to 1,000 shards, but it was my job for, I don't know, 12 years or something. So, you know, in the progress to where I am now, I wouldn't take any of it back, not even the broken heart, I don't think.
Well, I've been to a number of your live shows, actually, and you always make a point to tell us this little anecdote about why we should turn off our phones. I won't ruin it for any of you guys at home in case you happen to go to one of Natalie's live shows and live recordings of her podcast. But part of that is also saying how you used to be really nervous when you would get on stage, and this plays a role in the story because it made it worse and so on and so forth. But I'm really curious because you were clearly really nervous. You said that you would feel sick for days. Like, why would you continue doing something that seemed to cause you so much pain?
Yeah, I would think I was going to throw up every single day I had a gig. Yeah. But the thing is, the high is giddying. It's just giddying. And the trouble is, of course, that I now know, but didn't know then, is that the reason it is giddying is because you're so nervous. And I would just be so terrified. And all the time, the first few years of my stand-up career, I kept thinking, when I can just get to the point when I'm not afraid of it anymore, it'll all be all right. And of course, the sorry truth was that once I stopped being afraid of it, the high was never as good again. So, you know, it's the joy I have in going on stage now is a really different one. Because it just is different walking on stage. People aren't expecting, they're expecting me to be kind of funny, but they're not expecting to laugh every 30 seconds for the next hour and a half. And so the kind of status that I have now as like the funniest lecturer you're going to get this week or whatever is the vibe. And that's just much easier than being in front of a bunch of baying drunk people on a Friday night doing a late show, which was, you know, yeah, it could be a bit chastening.
So then what made you pull back to classics? Like, what made you kind of reassess to go,
what makes a person run away and join the circus and then run away from the circus and join the library? It's a good question. And the answer is that I bought a flat and I didn't want to never be in it. I spent my whole life on tour at that point, I guess, or my whole adult life on tour. I started gigging, you know, when I was still a student. So it was the only life I'd ever really known, was this sort of perpetual touring existence. And I thought, well, I've got a flat. I want to be in it. I had a boyfriend. I wanted to be with him. And so I made a kind of sideways move into writing for newspapers. I had a column in the Times and then the Independent. And so because of that, I think I thought I would quit. And Marcus Brigstock told me that I would never make it out of it for 2 years. And I said, yeah, whatever. He said, I'll see you back here in, you know, just under 2 years' time. Of course, he was right. I don't think I even made it to 18 months. But I was so sure, you know, and I miss performing. It's as much a part of me as writing is. And I would always have said, you know, you have this thing with stand-ups. It's like, are you a writer who performs or a performer who writes? You know, do you write the material because you need something to say? Or do you perform the material because you write the material? And I'm definitely the latter. And I would have absolutely died on that hill until COVID, when I missed performing like I lost a limb. It was awful. I missed it every week. And for a long time, I didn't miss the travel. The travel really is something. I mean, I get to go to really cool places and other people are paying. So I do see it's like, oh, my diamond shoes are too tight. But it is really shattering when you're not at home for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I'm like trying to, you know, work out how my plants aren't going to die while I'm away and things like that. Oh.
Priorities.
Yeah, exactly. And so that sort of thing had got really old pre-COVID. In fact, I didn't have any plants before COVID because I was just away all the time, and I was like, they'll just all die. And it felt like such a terrible metaphor for my existence. But then when we couldn't go anywhere, I missed it really badly. And I found myself kind of re-walking the routes that I'd walked in other cities and other countries and other continents. And I thought, well, yeah, no, it is just as much a part of me as anything else. So I was really, really glad to be able to get back to performing. And I mean, I performed the first day it was legal to perform in 2021 I performed, and the like 10 minutes it was legal to perform in 2020, I was on stage, and we'd had 6 months out, and I did a show at the Everyman in Cheltenham, and I cried during the sound check. I cried when I came. I was just like, it's all too much. I missed the theatre.
Oh
So,
my goodness.
yeah, I hope I don't ever have to quit it. I suppose there may come a time when people don't want to see it or whatever, but I hope I won't ever have to stop performing. I would miss it terribly.
The last part of this puzzle of your career that I can't piece together is actually your first book was a children's book called The Great Escape.
Yes,
which has a cat called Max.
Yeah, such a good name, isn't it?
He's from Belgium as well,
yes,
which I love.
I'm partly Belgian. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. So what led you down that path?
And nothing led me down the path except for the fact that I had this idea for a story in which a little girl was cleaning a window, and a cat came out of the building that she was cleaning the window of and she says, as I would always to a cat, "Hello, where have you come from?" And the cat replies and says, "Look, we haven't got time for this, we've got to go." And I thought it was such a cute idea, and so I essentially wrote the book around the idea. It has structural problems, I'm not going to defend it. My mum would be so cross with me right now. She's like, "I love that book." All right, but I would write it better now, but I'm not going to write it now. So yeah, no, I just had the idea for a book with a cat in it, and the cat talked, so it seemed like it had to be a book for children. I don't know, I should have pitched it as a sort of postmodern yada yada, and then I could have got away with it for adults probably, but yeah, you have to learn these things by doing them, I suppose. So yeah.
Your books actually were the first way that I was exposed to your work. So I got my degree from NYU back in 2017. I graduated, and then I didn't know what to do with a classics degree, as many of us don't. And so I moved home and I started working at a pub here, and I was looking to, stay with the classics and still engage with it. And I found Children of Jocasta. However, through doing all the research of this, I found that actually Children of Jocasta wasn't such a smooth journey for you, because you had to change agents and publishers on this, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, no, I always really enjoy it when I go on the interview circuit for my novels particularly. And one of the questions is, so now there are 85 million Greek myth retellings, and obviously, this is a huge sales pitch. And what made, and I'm like, you must have known when you set out to, yeah, I like your version. Yeah, I wrote a book called The Amber Fury that was published in 2014 that is a modern day retelling of Greek myth. But almost no one's ever noticed, which is fine. I didn't hammer it home. There's a lot of people reading.
I loved it. I reviewed it on my channel as well.
Well, thank you very much.
Loved it.
I think Edith Hall is the only person who has publicly observed that it's the Oresteia retold, which I wasn't particularly expecting anyone to notice, but I'm glad Edith did. And then I wanted to write a sort of actual, set in the Bronze Age version of the story of Oedipus. And specifically, of course, I wanted to reframe it because Jocasta has like 120 lines in the OT, and I thought it would be more fun to look at her perspective. And then I realized I'd always write multi-stranded novels that I would use Ismene as the other strand, not because I felt a huge amount of impatience with Antigone, although I'm not sure you would necessarily guess that from the final book, but just because I felt like Antigone had more attention already, and Ismene has 60 lines, I think, in Sophocles' Antigone. So I sort of pilfered things from like Euripides' version of Antigone, which we've only got in fragments, the Phoinicides, the Euripides version of the aftermath of the story also. And I thought that what I wanted to do, there's a moment in the OT where Jocasta says to Oedipus, "Oh, you don't need to worry about gods. They don't concern themselves with us. Oracles are just whatever." And it seems like such an astonishing moment to me that this 5th century BCE play that's being performed at a religious festival has a character in it going, "Yeah, gods, no gods, whatever." So I decided that what I wanted to do with it was strip away the sort of supernatural elements, take away the gods, take away the monsters. So the Sphinx, in my version, spoiler, is not a monster. It's something much more human. And the gods are, I suppose, a representation of psychological disorder, I guess. So Jocasta particularly is rational until the worst things happen to her, and then she becomes kind of almost obsessively superstitious, something which I'm afraid to say I stole from Aeneid 4 rather than from a Greek source, but there you go. And so I thought that it was a good idea for a narrative, but it was really hard to persuade anyone else. So yeah, I did. I changed agents over it, and I changed publishers over it, and I was really lucky to come to Peter Strauss because he is my dream agent. He reads things really quickly. He immediately got what I was trying to do. He didn't see there being any kind of disparity between my stage performing and the radio shows and the novels. He was like, but it's all one project. And it's like, yes, it is. Finally, someone gets it. So he's always really got it. He's a brilliant reader also, which helps. But yeah, he read it, and I was pretty, I was pretty bruised. I think a lot of people hadn't wanted a manuscript that I had written before, after Great Escape, I think, but before Ancient Guide. So I knew exactly how it felt to get rejected by like 25 people, and it really sucks. And he read it. He said, I won't be able to read it tonight because I've got an event with Caroline Duffy. And I said, yes, that's fine, thinking, do you represent Caroline? I should have looked at your, okay, yeah, no, that's quite impressive. Yeah, sorry. And he said, I'll read it the weekend. And I said, okay, fine. And then he rang me like a day and a half later and said, it's great. It'll go to Picador and they'll have it. And I said, okay. And then he properly just went for it and just told them that they would have it. And they just accepted it. And it was all fine. I was like, this is all we had to do, because I thought it would be harder than this. It was looking really alarming for a really long time. Did I just have to wait for you to announce the world's desired outcome and then it would all be right, great. So yeah, no, it was a huge relief. And then when Jocasta came out, it was quite it was a small buzz. That there was definitely a buzz. The radio show had been building, I guess, in the background, because when did Jocasta came out in 2017, so we'd done, I guess, 3 series of Stand Up for the Classics by then, because we're in our 10th year now. Yeah, so it felt, like things were ready. And then obviously when Ships came out, everything went crazy, and then it was now.
So on that journey, what gave you the confidence? Because like you said, like, if people are rejecting it and that you have something, like, what was it in you that you were like, no, this book is different and you're wrong?
Yeah, it's not really confidence so much as refusal to accept things. When people ask how to get a career in the media or as a writer, I usually say you have to bang your head against the wall until the wall breaks, and the whole time you do it, you have to pretend it doesn't hurt. And that is exactly how I have lived my life, I'm sorry to say, in absolute flat out denial. It's like, you know what, I might have written a manuscript that's not good enough. And I have, although people did want the much rejected manuscript that went after Amber, I think, people would, and I was like, no, if it wasn't good enough before, then it's not good enough now. You don't have it now. You can't put a dress on her and take her to the prom now. You're too late. So yeah, she went with another boy. The boy is the bottom of a drawer. So yeah, once something's kind of broken in my eyes, I won't retain a belief that particular thing is worth, reselling or saving specifically. But I didn't ever question, I think, that I would write a thing that would work. And that just comes down to, self-belief / profound narcissism, I suppose. It's hard to know, isn't it? Because from the inside, that sort of delusional lunatic and the, committed genius, they must feel exactly the same. So you don't really know. If everybody is telling you no, then they may have a point. They may just be right. But I just felt more sure with Jocasta. I felt like the people who should have been reading it weren't reading it in the way it was intended. And I felt like that might be on them. And one of the questions I find really difficult to answer, which I now never have to, because now Greek myth retelling is a genre, but people would say, well, what kind of book is it? It's a good book. I don't know what kind of book it is. It's it's not historical fiction because it's set in myth. It's not the version of the story that you already know. So what is it? Counter-historical, counterfactual, counter-mythical? Is that even a thing? And, you know, I'm not always sure that we want these boxes to put things in because it's easy, but it's not relevant to readers. And one of the great joys of social media, although I know there are plenty of reasons not to be overjoyed by it, has been the democratization of ideas and of categories of books. So, you know, what you get is people who are simply saying, essentially to publishers amongst other people as they publish their views, this is the kind of book I like. And then loads and loads of people agreeing with them. And it's like, yeah, it turns out there was a market, you just didn't know. I mean, Ships was turned down by some enormous number of publishers in America, like 20, 25, something like that. For a while, I'm pretty sure it was like an interview question, you know, where somebody would say, you know, are there any questions you'd like to ask at the end of the interview? And someone would say, yes, would you buy Natalie Haynes's novel, 1,000 Shifts? And then you just had to say no and you got the job. And only after it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize was it picked up there. And the reasons that people gave for having rejected it were all perfectly valid in their minds, and, you know, to mine to a degree as well, you know, which was that there isn't a market for it in the States. And then, you know, a year and a half later, when it was for quite a brief time, but nonetheless, cheerily sitting as the #1 best-selling audiobook in the States, somewhere where I had no, you know, audience as a reader, and it is me reading it. I was like, you know what, there was a market. You just didn't know there was a market. So that's been quite satisfying. Being quite mature in some ways. I try not to say I told you so, but I'm not that mature, so I am thinking it really loudly, and I've got no poker face at all. So yeah.
Well, also, did you know this, that the week that Ships came out, you outsold Homer?
Well, where's his gig schedule, hey?
That's a fun
is
fact for
he
you.
turning up or not? Laziness. That's all I can attribute that to. 2,700 years of sitting around, Homer, finally doesn't pay off. You've had it your way for too long. Yeah, well, I mean, I spent a lot. I think I gigged 75 shows the year that Ships came out. It came out in the May of that year, and I played 75 shows, and the furthest flung one was Christchurch, New Zealand. So it was a really long tour. It was a gorgeous tour, but it was a really long tour, which is how, fun fact, I got back. I probably shouldn't say this. Oh well. I got back and had 10 weeks left to write the remaining 55,000 words of Pandora's Jar, which is why it was always a real struggle when people interviewed me about that book, and they said, so why did you pick these women? Yeah, honestly, I was in such a rush. I didn't really choose. It's just like, who's
These are the ones I knew.
She'll do. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it was a mighty tour, but that is part of it. You know, I'm really lucky that my live audience likes my books, and my readers like the live shows and the podcast and stuff. So they do all feed each other. But Peter, my agent, was the first person to realize that would be true. I felt like, again, that I was just banging my head against a wall. It's like, look, the show is funny, the book is sad, it's still fine, they're both by me, it'll all be all right. But it took a while, and Peter saw straight away that it would all fit.
So moving to Divine Might, which is your newest release, and at the time that this video is released, I'm like 99% sure it comes out in paperback.
Yes,
so
25th of April it comes out.
Yes, brilliant. Yep. So I went to the opening night actually of the Divine Might tour when you did it at the Bloomsbury Theatre.
That was a good night, wasn't it?
It was
I was
so
still
fun.
making that show up so badly. It is a better show now, I promise. It was absolute carnage.
It was so great. And since I went there, I've been like watching your other promotion for Divine Might as well, obviously in preparation for this, because I was like, what's a new question that I can ask Natalie about this book? You have been asked every question about this book, and you have spoken about every single woman that you have written about. So instead, the only questions that I could think of that was slightly different were, for starters, if we look at all the women that you've written about, you know, you've got Demeter, Hestia, even the Furies are written about in there, all to such beautiful length. But I was wondering, from your perspective as a classicist, as someone who studied this their whole life, who was the woman that you learned the most about?
Hestia,
really?
Easily. Yeah, I realized I knew nothing about her. I mean, not really. I knew that she was the Greek counterpart of Vesta, and I knew a bit about Vesta because of it, you know, her role in Roman sort of civic religion and her kind of co-opting by Augustus. So I felt like I knew that bit, but the kind of depth of and there's a real beauty to Hestia, and I think this sort of sense of her being at the very center of things, which doesn't appear in any of the narratives that we're used to reading. You know, she's not one of the squabbling gods on the battlefield in the Iliad. She's not one of the intervening gods in the Argonautica or in the Odyssey. You know, she's not on the battlefield with the other gods in the Gigantomachy. It's like, well, where is she? And once you realize that she's described as the first and the last, you know, in the Homeric hymn, we're told that she gets the first bit of every sacrifice and the last bit of every, to every god, not just to her. And that once you realize that fireplaces are this kind of sacred space to her, every fireplace, not just ones in temples, not just ones in her temples, but in every god's temples, in every civic space where there's a fireplace, in every home where there's a hearth, that's, you know, she is one of those protective spirits, one of those. It's like, how did this goddess go from being literally everywhere to suddenly being nowhere? And so, yeah, she was, I absolutely loved writing her chapter. I had a complete ball. And I was really lucky that my friend Sophie Hay is, she works at Pompeii. And so she's like a super expert on Vesta, as she is for the Pompeians, of course. So she could just send me pictures of fantastic frescoes and stuff. So every time I had a sort of fresco anxiety, I just it's like the bat signal, but with archaeologists. So I like to send up the small light thing of a trowel into the sky. Then Sophie answers. She comes and tells me a useful thing about a fresco. It's perfect.
So then, as well, with all of these women, what chapter do you think is the most important for the public? Because you interact with
yeah, Demeter, I think, because I've been so kind of vexed watching the sort of co-opting of the Persephone story into this kind of romantic, it's like goth romance vibe where Hades is a god who loves too much and he can't help himself but take this beautiful, it's like, I'm sorry, 1, she's a literal child, it's child abuse. 2, it's kidnap. 3, it's trafficking. 4, it's forced marriage. There is nothing romantic about this. I know it's really tempting to think that this kind of rich, powerful, I mean, his name literally means rich and as Plutos, that this wealthy, super powerful god is just so overwhelmed by her beauty that I can absolutely see the sort of slightly dubious power dynamics narrative in play, but that doesn't make it all right. It just doesn't. So, you know, it doesn't mean there are no romantic versions of Orpheus and Eurydice or of Hades and Persephone that I don't enjoy as opera or in art or whatever, but it's like, can we please not pretend that this is just fine? It's really, really, really dodgy. And Demeter, I think, is such a hero. She is such a, you know, she's completely underestimated by her brother and, well, by her 2 brothers, by her daughter's father, Zeus, and her daughter's uncle, Hades, who conspire to kidnap her daughter and take her to Hades. And she basically threatens to hold the world to ransom, to starve us out until we all die and nobody makes a single offering to a single god until they give her daughter back. And I can really relate to that kind of, you know, yeah, this is where this ends now. It's just something completely extraordinary about her. And the Homeric hymn to Demeter is such a beautiful poem. And I read it, you know, I must have read some of it in Greek before, I think, but you know, it's obviously quite long. I hadn't read it in the detail that I read. And this is the only chapter, I think, in Divine Might that it's just a close follow of a single account. You know, the other accounts and later versions, there's some gorgeous modern versions of the story of Persephone and Demeter, Caroline Duffy again, Evan Boland, Alicia Stallings, A.E. Stallings, the poet. And so it was lovely to be able to bring all these in and artworks and everything. But essentially the spine of that chapter is the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is just an absolutely incredible poem that I wish was, you know, a set text in schools. I think it's really important.
I did a video about that. That was one of my first videos on YouTube, was because I do summaries basically. I'm like, oh, if you don't want to read, I'll help you and then go read the book. I'll like always leave out the most important thing. Like what irritated everybody was in my Iliad series, I left out Achilles' shield. I was like, now you go read, like, go have fun.
Yeah.
But I remember doing a video on that and the backlash in the comments, even though I was like, I'm just telling you the story. It's just not the story that you want to hear.
Of course. And it does happen. Someone came and asked me, I recorded an episode of the podcast / radio show at Hay Festival last year. We'll do it again this summer. And someone came up to me after the recording and she said, is there no romance? Oh my God, I feel like I've just kicked the Easter bunny. No, there's no romance, and I would never kick a bunny. I'm vegetarian. But yeah, no, I felt really bad because people do want a romantic story, but I think there are better forms of romance than an uncle kidnapping his child niece and trafficking her to the underworld. So it's a bleak story, and I understand why we'd rather not see that sometimes. But I think, you know, the whole, if we all look away, then the sexual abuse of children will stop narrative has prevailed for quite a long time. And as far as I can see, it's literally 0% of the time successful. So I would rather, I guess, we tried a slightly less romanticizing attitude and a slightly more eyes wide open attitude.
So then, speaking of love stories, what's a love story that then people who are listening to this who are like, oh my God, my heart is broken. I am now on the floor, melting into a puddle. What's a love story that, you know, from the ancient world that you could direct them to, where you're like, well, this isn't as bad as that one?
I mean, the short answer is Demeter and Persephone, right? I mean, the love between mother and daughter is gorgeous. And I think it's a narrative that we're sort of starting to see edging back, I think, into. I remember thinking, I haven't seen this happen for a while, when Frozen came out, and it turns out, spoiler, 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 it turns out that her true love is her sister. Of course it is. So that's the person who can save her. That's what we want to see. It's like, yes, thank you. It's lovely. That's exactly right. And I feel very much the same about the Demeter Persephone story. I think we're now seeing that kind of centering of the story of a love for that a mother can have for her daughter, or a daughter for her mother. I think it's really beautiful and really sincere in a really different way. And as for a sort of love, a romantic love story, got a big warm space in my heart for Philemon and Baucis. It's so sad and beautiful, and it reminds me of the Buried Giant. Is that the Ishiguro I'm thinking of? It made me think of it so much when I was reading that. But Philemon and Baucis is just beautiful, you know, a love so profound that even after death they stay together. It's like, you know, I wish I didn't still have terrible weakness for the kind of super intense, super emotional, you know, Catullus or Sappho style love where you just can't think of anything else and it's the only thing you want. I am still absolutely, I have that exact teenage attitude to love now, and I am definitely old enough to know better and have been for a long time. But at the same time, I am properly grown up, so I can see that there's a real beauty in that kind of gorgeous, loving companionship that lasts even past death.
I am just aware of the time, Natalie, so we will have to just kind of wrap this up and ask one last question for you. And I like to leave on a piece of advice for everybody who is watching. So when it comes to looking at your whole journey, you know, you've gone through so much and you've broken so many boundaries and you've created this whole incredible career for yourself, despite everything. So what's the advice that you could give to a young female classicist that looks up to you? You know, maybe somebody who's still at school or at university, who's looking up to you and going, gosh, I would love to be in Natalie's position. Like, what's something that you wish that you had heard at that age that you think would have helped through all of those turmoils and roadblocks in your career that you had to get over?
I think I wish most that someone had told me that it was actually okay when it goes wrong. And that sounds like such a negative thing to say, but hear me out. I think I treated everything as like do or die all the time. I mean, and I still struggle not to do it now. And it's only really in the last sort of decade or so, maybe 15 years, that I've come to accept that it, you know, there are ways in which you can fail and you can get so much from it that even though it hurts and even though you start to pick yourself up, it's actually okay, and you won't die of it, and no one else will die of it because you're not a heart surgeon. You're trying to make a book or a radio show or whatever. So it's all right. But you know, it still pains me, that sense that that everything has to be, you have to achieve it all first time through, otherwise, you know, somehow it's a huge failure. And it's always from the other kind of the non-creative part of my life. I do kickboxing and I run a lot. And and I do weight training. And when I'm training with my lovely friend Neil, he'll give me like some horrendous circuit to do. And then on the third set of reps, I'll go to do the thing that I've now done twice. And I literally cannot do it the same number of times this time because my muscles are already tired. And it's like I'll get sort of like to 8 when I'm supposed to be getting to 10. And then I literally, my body will physically fold. It's like, I cannot go further. And he's like, then you've done as much as you can. And it's like, but I didn't do the number. And he's like, but it doesn't matter. You know, if you go as far as you can until you collapse, then you did as much as you can. That's all anyone's going to ask you. And next week you're going to be stronger. And it's like, oh my God, where were you when I was 17? And I thought every exam I ever sat, I had to get 100% or the world would end. Where was this wisdom then? So that is the piece of advice I would offer you. It's actually okay to fail. If you tried your absolute utmost, then, you know, you'll get something out of it. And next time you'll be stronger.
And on that note, that is actually a lovely note to end on, Natalie. What an uplifting piece of advice. Thank you so, so much for joining me today and for educating us and helping us understand your career and all of the incredible feats that you have gone through in order to get to become the Natalie Haynes sitting in front of me. And of course, thank you to all of you guys who continue to watch and support the channel. You guys can find links to not only Divine Might, but the rest of Natalie's books in the description below, along with her socials, and of course, Natalie Haynes Stands Up for the Classics. It is all linked below. It is super, super easy. If you guys want to find anything, don't forget to open that box down there. So thank you guys so much, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on MoAn Inc. I'll see you guys then.